So here we are, 12 minutes to 11, nearing the end of a day in which millions of things have happened, some happy, some tragic, frightening or reassuring, most of them undramatic, domestic, routine and frankly dull. And out of this quotidian maelstrom, BBC editors earlier tonight selected 10 events as constituting the news. They'll all also be in tomorrow's newspapers, and whether you pay any attention to them or not, the world will continue to turn, and by this time tomorrow, there'll be a lot more news. What's it all for? What is all this exposure to events over which we have no control doing to us? Before we talk about it, here's the writer Alain de Botton's take.
The news doesn't come with any instructions.
Hello, very good afternoon.
At school, they teach you how to analyse books and pictures, but no one ever tells you how to make sense of that far more powerful, questionable art form, the news. We're taught to decode Shakespeare, but not the celebrity section of the Daily Mail, George Eliot, but not the Sun. And yet the news is the most powerful force out there, shaping how we view political and economic reality. No wonder revolutionaries head to the TV and radio stations first whenever they want to change stuff. Here's my list of some of what's questionable about the news. Modern democratic nations think badly of censorship. They pride themselves on how much information is out there. But there's an awkward fact about information. If you have too much of it, it starts to numb you. You lose the thread. You forget what you were even interested in, or what could be changed. Rather than making us more political, an excess of information can erode any sense of what the real priorities are. Here's the paranoid, frightening thought. If you want to make people accepting of the status quo, you've got two options. Either give them no news at all, or, more slyly, give them the opposite. So much news, they'll drown in it. Then nothing will ever have to change. Thoughtful people often imagine that what makes news organisations serious and worthy is their ability to provide us with information that's unbiased. But this bias against bias is fundamentally mistaken. Facts only become meaningful to us when they slot into some picture of what matters. Neutrality is simply impossible vis-à-vis the biggest questions. Think of the big figures of history: Plato, the Buddha, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. All of these have been highly biased. Their judgments were anything but perfectly balanced. We don't need news stripped of bias. We need news presented to us with the best kinds of bias. The news might tell us what's happening in the economic establishment, but it fails to tell us what might or should happen. It sets an agenda, but this agenda is woefully limited. The so-called debate about the economy doesn't stray beyond some tightly defined lines, restricting the audience's understanding of what's actually possible. Alternative views soon end up in the territory of what's dismissed as radical and ridiculous. The news terrifies us every day about floods, fires, cancer. And at the same time, it makes us furious, mostly at apparently incompetent people running the country, messing everything up. News outlets badly need their audiences to be agitated, frightened and bothered a lot of the time. And yet we have an even greater responsibility to try to remain resilient and to see that the news is in part at least winding us up for its own ends, to keep itself in a job. We hear about terrible catastrophes all the time, 300 gone here, 1,000 starving there, and yet in our hearts we often don't much care. Is it because we're shallow and cold? No, it's just that the news doesn't help us to care, because it parachutes us into places only when disaster strikes. But we can't care about people in trouble when we didn't know them when things were okay. We need to know the steady state of a land before we can be motivated to care about its crises. The news ends up corrupting us with a sense of the overwhelming importance of our own era and concerns, our debt, our affairs, our parties, our rogue missiles. But a good life involves realizing that there are moments when the news no longer has anything important to teach us, when we have to leave it behind to focus more intently on some of our own anxieties and hopes in a brief time we're all allotted.
Well, now here to discuss all of that, Alan de Botton, the author of a new book, The News, A User's Manual, Samira Ahmed, a journalist and presenter of Newswatch, the BBC programme which keeps a watch on how news is reported, and Alistair Campbell, former Fleet Street hack, best known for having served as Tony Blair's Director of Communications. Several times in your book, you make a comparison between religion and news. What do you mean?
Well, religion used to be the place you went to find out what was important, what mattered, what the meaning of life was. And all those things we've taken now to the news. The news is the thing that guides us, that tells us what's important. But the interesting thing is, we never think, here's something that we should learn to ingest with a little bit of care. We get taught how to read books, how to look at pictures. No one ever says, there's this thing called the news, and it's a very strange phenomenon, and you need to think of a few things before going near it. No one ever teaches us how to take in the news, and that's really what I'm interested in.
Do you recognise this picture, Alistair?
I do. I read Alan's book earlier today, and I do agree with a lot of the thesis, and I do think there is now a need for a kind of education about the modern media, because I think there's very little self-analysis within the media about itself. And I think some of the points he made, even within that film, we saw Emily earlier talking about Labour and the trade unions. Everything has to be presented as really new, really big, really important, the new this, the new that, the biggest since the last big thing. And that's because you
Of course.
Yes, I know. I'm not, but I'm saying that that's you say of course, but part of your job as
you want us to come on air and say nothing much happened today, or here's a few old stories.
Jeremy, you made a speech not many years ago where you said that some days you should do exactly that.
I think you probably should, and nobody does. But on a regular day, that is a significant story.
No, I'm not saying it's not a significant story. I'm not criticising Emily for the story. I'm simply saying that news has become what somebody, an editor, a presenter, decides is of interest. But for the viewer, yes, of course, I'm not saying that's new. I'm simply saying I agree with Alain that the reader, the viewer, people growing up in Britain today where the media is much more prevalent than it ever used to be, I think there is a need for people, in a sense, to get an education about where it's coming from and often why.
Right. OK, Samira, it is ubiquitous. You accept that?
It is, but the one thing I would agree with both Alan and Alistair on is that education is important. And I speak in schools a lot, and I'm always struck by the fact that essentially watching the news is like critical appreciation, and you should approach it with that critical detachment. And most young people actually get that very, very quickly, but they need to be taught it as part of a general thing. My greater concern is this idea that somehow the news is somehow not made by individuals who are it's somehow a force out there. And one, I think it gives a sense of community, and people can turn on and tune into a sense of what's going on in the outer world and feel connected to it in a positive way. Sometimes it makes them angry.
They can't do a damn thing about it.
Sometimes they can. I mean, an interesting example of a story which there's a lot of cynicism about how it's reported is the changes to the NHS, for example. Newswatch has got a lot of complaints over the last few months about they felt biased in the way it's reported. There's a whole political party that's been set up on that. Now, you could argue about what the truth of it is, but people have been motivated to take action. Another great example, just to give you one briefly, is because in your book you talk about this drip where news isn't given context. The Staffordshire hospital scandal, that emerged because individual stories of patients dying were being reported anecdotally to journalists.
But now
you've got a campaign,
we have
you
coverage,
get
now we have coverage
trial.
of the National Health Service right across the media that only wants to focus on the National Health Service being bad when the National Health Service is actually very, very good.
Well,
everyone knows the National Health Service is pretty
knows.
good, which is why when it goes bad, it's news.
No, but it's used to be. I used to have a colleague on the Daily Mirror called Jill Palmer. She was the health correspondent. Her job was to write good stories about the National Health Service. She was laid off because basically the then editor, who I think was Piers Morgan, I can't remember, basically said there's no longer a market for these good stories about the National Health Service because because the news and the nature of the news has changed.
But
Isn't that changed because of spin doctors, then?
Right, let's
I mean,
decide
do
what
you
news
accept,
is
do you accept
then.
no
We'll see if we
responsibility
can.
for feeding a news agenda?
No, not at all. I really
Well, no,
don't.
I just want to answer one question. I mean, you said just a year or so ago that the one thing that still makes you wake up and think, did I really do that, was getting Tony Blair to join the Free Deirdre
that was ridiculous.
Rashid story.
Yeah.
Now, there's an argument that was a distraction, which the Murdoch press was very pleased to take up to distract from another story.
It was me responding to a question and having a bit of a laugh, and you're now years later remembering it and thinking it was
You
serious.
talked about it last year.
No, I did, but Jeremy, can I just say as well, Alan talked
I
about the
want to-
Olympics in the book.
yeah.
And I think it's a really
That
good
was a
example.
good news story, wasn't it?
Exactly. But up until the point of the opening ceremony, the media was busting a gut. You could feel them thinking, God, I think this is
all
going to
of
go
them.
wrong.
I think the interesting
Not
thing is
all of
Beginning
them, but
to
the
sound a bit
balance
like
of
Martin
opinion.
Lewis, frankly.
I think the interesting thing is that the news, when it's looking for corruption, and the news spends a lot of time looking for corruption, it always imagines that corruption comes in the handy shape of one bad egg that can be put in a prison van and taken away.
They don't
a lot
say
of the problem,
that.
No, but a lot of the problems facing our society
complicated.
are more complicated, and they don't involve criminal negligence. They involve stupidity, laxness, lazy thinking, etc. And that's very hard for the news machine to get its teeth into.
Well,
It
I think
isn't.
that's absolute tripe.
No.
What about government spending on computer systems, for example?
Absolutely,
That's
brilliant
not
story.
criminality. That's just incompetence.
No, but a very important story.
Yeah,
but one
and
that
very well reported.
Yeah, but one that really struggles. If you look at the figures of, say, who's clicking on the Justin Bieber going crazy in Panama City story versus who's clicking on stories of chaos in the DRC.
Well, I'm afraid we're not all imbued with your high
You know,
spirits.
sometimes you can
but I
have a
think that's
bit
a real
of fun
challenge.
too.
No, I know, I agree. But I think the real challenge is, in a sort of multi-channel world, is how do you get the most important news to be the most popular? At the moment there's a yawning divide between news which is important and news which is popular. And in a democracy that really matters. What you want to do is to yoke the two together.
That's another thing that comes throughout your book. You're always talking about what the news should do.
Indeed, I'm trying to make it better.
Well, no, you're not. You're trying to
That's
make it
your
into
job,
something
Jeremy.
else.
You do that as well.
Everybody's.
I think anyone who loves news is
anyone who's in
Everybody's
this
entitled
business
to try to do it.
Yes,
But that's the difference between good journalism and bad journalism. And a lot of your complaints are just about bad or sloppy journalism.
Absolutely. And let's get ambitious about what we can do. We're still one of the first generations to know about news, to have so much news on offer. We're still working out how it works. And I think it's natural we're a bit confused sometimes. We don't know how to handle,
You suggest
No,
it's
but I
got a
think we
moral
do.
purpose beyond informing people.
Yes,
that
I
it should
think-
be changing them.
I think the point of the news is to make the nation flourish, to help the nation to go better. That's why we're interested in criminality. That's why we're interested in scandals, because we're trying to get things to go
But
better.
who makes that judgment?
Well, I think that's the collective, in a democracy, it's a collective voice of
how's it
many news
expressed?
No, but I can
outlets.
just say it gets better because you expose wrongdoing and people might challenge it. One of the most important aspects of news reporting, which you in your book write about quite cynically, about all these headlines about criminal trials, there's something really wonderful about seeing a criminal trial that brings bad people to justice.
I agree.
Most
And
of the courts
sometimes
now
it's
are
an individual
covered.
example, but you can change the law and you can change behaviour.
Alice says something very interesting in a lecture he gave in Cambridge, saying, you quoted Carl Bernstein saying that Watergate had been the greatest journalistic story of the 20th century, but it had ruined journalism.
Yeah. Well, his point was that because Watergate was such a big story and it's still the sort of yardstick, that now journalism is only journalism if it's bringing somebody down, preferably somebody in a position of real power.
politicians try and
And that
do
is
that.
not just... They may do,
Well, a
and that's
great
part of the
example
political
is Fred
debate.
Goodwin and being stripped of his knighthood. I don't think there was a public appetite baying to say take away his knighthood. There was a public appetite to say there's something wrong with the system.
That's hardly as big as
But
Watergate.
it isn't. And the point is that we had a government which very cynically threw him to the wolves and encouraged the news machine to kind of operate.
Possibly, that
around
does happen. I agree that
But
that
we have a
that
PR man
happens.
who's our prime minister now. I mean, there's a kind of an interesting relationship between politics and an attempt to manipulate the news agenda,
There is,
which
but
you know all too well
I do
about.
know all about it. But let me say this: that I think that the relationship between media and politics. Let me give you one example. You look at this wall. There's more media than ever.
Yeah.
Even when I was on the Daily Mirror, there were 2 reporters whose job was to cover debates in Parliament. We now have thousands of hours a day, and you can go into Parliament, which is meant to be the sort of cradle of democracy and the rest of it. There's nobody in there covering it.
Well, there's
And
no
so-
one
I
on the
agree.
benches half the time.
No, but
Well,
then
hardly
that feeds
anyone.
itself. That
No, I
feeds
agree.
itself.
There's an issue about political
And
reporting.
then they say, well, we've got the
All right.
Parliament channel, which nobody watches. So I think I agree with that. I think part of your job, the media collective, is to say it's not just about sales, it's not just about ratings. We are part of an important
But then
process involving the
politicians
public.
have to not try and
I
play that
agree with
game where
that.
they're creating little
I
policy
agree with
ideas
that.
and trying to feed
but they
this
wouldn't be
agenda
doing that
everywhere.
if they didn't feel they were forced onto this agenda the whole time. Go to more mature countries like Germany, you'll find there's less of it going going on.
Maybe. Well, can I just bring it back to the viewers? Because every week we have people who email in, and I think your book implies that somehow people feel helpless and they somehow are manipulated by the
social
news.
media is giving them a...
Well, I
big
think
voice.
we can kind of put too much emphasis on social media. Most people are not on Twitter engaging in conversations. A lot
Most
of
young
journalists
people aren't watching
are.
the BBC.
Right.
But
Look,
an awful lot
as
of
you know,
audiences
the media have a very short attention span.
are very aware
story.
of what's
We're
going
moving
on.
on now.
To the next scandal.
But you can always contact Newswatch and complain about bad
Yeah.
coverage, and we'll tackle it with BBC
And
bosses.
too little time.
Editor of
given to things
Newnight
too.
has yet to commit to a date to come on. We've been asking for months. We'd love a date.
yeah, come on. Where's the editor of Newsnight? Come on,
bring-
get on there.
If
Thank
he
you.
doesn't come, I will.
Good bad, Jeremy.
Promise.
We want the editor.
Making progress.
Now, you may recall